Todd here with Vineyard Canada. Glad you could join us for this time together. Having difficult conversations is something none of us enjoy, and yet all of us face them. Difficult conversations are difficult for several reasons. We want to touch on four main themes and how you might be more effective in those themes. Let's jump in. I had the opportunity over a 4-year period to receive my executive certification in conflict management. It was about 100 plus hours of training and hands-on experience through an organization in Toronto called the Stitt-Felt Handy Group. The program I took was affiliated with the University of Windsor Faculty of Law. Most of the material in this talk is taken from that training I received and that I put into practice since graduating in 2015. I've come from the theological posture that all truth is God's truth. So while we might not be able to quote verses for the scriptures of conflict management, the biblical arc that embraces the need can be seen in the wisdom of the scriptures and consistently invites us to becoming peacemakers. For example, in Romans chapter 12, Paul is summarizing how life reoriented to following Jesus would actually look. He's pulling out some of the strands of a transformed life and he's naming them. In verse 18, he says, "If it is possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone." So Paul is helping them see the expanse of this transformed life. It's not only with the Christian community that we want to reach for peacemakers, but even with the outside world, as Paul indicates. And Jesus goes on, or has said, "Blessed be the peacemakers, for they will be called the children of God." So having difficult conversations well is about learning how to be an effective peacemaker. So what do most of us fear about difficult conversations? And why do they often not actually go well? Well, I'm sure you have answers or ideas for how you would respond to those two questions. Most of us are ill-equipped to have a difficult conversation. We then either avoid them or enter them poorly, or we actually damage relationships in the process. A key to doing better in our challenging conversations is to begin with understanding what actually makes them challenging in the first place. So what makes a conversation difficult for you? Once we understand the cause, it's easier to plan a response that is likely to help us succeed, whether the issue is with a friend, a fellow leader, or pastor, team member, or family member. Challenging situations, by definition, are challenging. So what is the realistic goal of a difficult conversation? Well, really, it's to make them easier than they would be otherwise. It's to make them more productive than they might be otherwise. And it's to make them less damaging than they might be otherwise. So to reach that goal, we need to first understand the four themes of difficult conversations. And those themes are identity, feelings, strong emotions, what actually happened, and what lies beneath. So in this first video, we'll cover the first two, and in the second video, we'll cover the latter two themes. So let's jump into identity. Most people get upset or defensive when their sense of self is challenged directly or indirectly. It's often why most of us feel stressed when we're being evaluated, or defensive when people attack our character, or when a spouse or a close friend uses vulnerable information about us against us in an argument. These type of conflicts go straight at our sense of self. Each of us has a sense of self. It's important to have that. We are often aware of some of the elements that we believe define who we are. Maybe things you've thought of are like, "You can always count on me," or "I always look out for the underdog," or "Keeping my word is very important to me," or "For me, being a good father is one of my highest goals." So while there are aspects of our identity that we feel are quite solid, there may be other areas where we have questions. Although people have different identity issues, some common identity questions include, am I competent enough? Am I a good person? Am I enough? Am I worthy of love and belonging? Some conversations are upsetting to us because whether we recognize it or not, in the moment, we believe that one of our key attributes of how we define ourselves is actually under attack. Our identity is being put in question. If you pride yourself on being a good father, hearing your daughter say she was disappointed that you missed her recital is not just about the fact you missed the recital, it's about the fact that you're not a good father. And so you could miss the main point with your daughter, which was that you missed the recital because all you're hearing is that you're not a good father. And so when we hear we are failed at something that's deeply important to us, it goes at our identity. If you pride yourself on being open-minded and compassionate, and yet someone tells you you're not agreeing with their view on sexuality and that you're closed-minded, it goes at the core of your belief about yourself. That conversation could become difficult for you because of that. If you believe you're a follower of Jesus and honestly seeking his will for your life, but another person disagrees with your life choices, it goes at your core belief about yourself. It could be hard for you to hear what they are saying. If a conversation challenges our sense of identity, there's a risk that it will become a difficult conversation. If on some level you experience the conversation as being about whether you're a good father, a closed-minded person, unfaithful, you'll go into great pains to defend yourself. That's natural, that's human nature. The more you experience the conversation as being about who you are, the less able you are to take it in and respond appropriately to the immediate information. It's harder to be more objective. Your daughter's missed recital, your differing views on sexuality or life choices, they challenge your identity, and that is what's at the core of all of us. If one sees the world in absolutes, either you are a good person or not, then almost any negative feedback is likely to raise identity issues. We generally have two responses when this occurs. We take it too hard, yes, I'm a horrible person for forgetting your birthday, or we will resist input at all costs. We'll deflect, we'll attack, we'll blame others, we'll do anything before we could question what's being said about our identity. So being aware that others may have adopted an either-or sense of self will make you mindful about the comments you are making or their experience of them based on their worldview. So take a moment, maybe even pause the video if you want. What are 3 or 5 qualities that really define you? I'll give you a moment to think about it. Maybe there's some of the things that we talked about. Maybe there are other things. For example, if I believe I'm reliable and that is core to who I am, any conversation that has my reliability in question most likely will be a difficult conversation for me. It's important to know what your triggers are for difficult conversations. When my identity is put in question, I may freeze, I might get defensive, I might actually become aggressive. So here's a few tips for avoiding identity issues and how they might complicate conversations. First of all, be aware of your own identity issues so that you can be aware of how they might be triggered in a conversation. It's important when faced with negative feedback to remember that it is only part of the picture. It may be a significant part of the picture, but is not the whole. Recognize and accept that you will make mistakes. Learn to integrate information into your perception of yourself in a healthy way. In certain circumstances, you may want to raise your identity issues explicitly so the other person can be sensitive to them in conversation. Being a good father is so important to me, so this is going to be a hard conversation for me, you could say. Being aware that a conversation might trigger identity issues for the other person is equally important. All right, let's talk about the second issue, emotions, or our emotional footprint. How we feel about issues being discussed or the way in which it is being discussed can play a very important role in a difficult conversation. In fact, how we feel during a conversation can be the most significant criteria for determining whether we experience the conversation as challenging. It is because a discussion makes us sad or angry or afraid or concerned or frustrated that we think of it as an actually difficult conversation. So let's take a moment to understand our emotional footprint. Like a sponge that soaks up water, the human soul soaks in emotion. However, like a sponge, our souls have a capacity and must be wrung out to absorb more water. The human soul must be respected in this way. Curating our souls is very important. Recognizing our emotional capacity is equally important. If we do not regularly release our emotions or curate them or process them, and by wringing them out like a sponge, we will transfer our emotions from one relationship or one event to another, and we will have to actually mop up our emotional spills. As our sponge gets full and spills on the floor and mixes with other relationships. So how might you decompress and release emotions on a regular basis? For me, I've discovered hiking in the mountains is one of the best ways I wring out my soul. Neither are we emotional potato heads. You're familiar with the toy, the potato head, where you take in the ears and the mouth and the eyes and you switch them around. Well, we actually can't just swap out happy for sad or sad for mad. We're integrated beings, and we need to be true to our emotions that we're feeling, and then we need to learn how to wring them out, or they will actually make bigger messes for us. We frequently fail to recognize the role of emotions in a difficult conversation. There's a tendency to try and edit out our emotional content in a conversation. Many people try to suppress their emotions or the emotions of the other person in an attempt to keep the conversation rational. In most cases, emotions eventually come out. We will either act on our emotions immediately. We might become sarcastic, we might become angry, weepy, they're more demonstrative, or actually we might walk them out in our behavior over time towards the other person. We'll start to avoid that person. We'll start to disengage from the relationship. That's an emotional response that we actually didn't address. So holding emotions back, keeping them out of the conversation may only ensure that they burst onto the scene when we no longer can hold them back. So the question really is not whether your emotions will come out, but how and when. So here's a handful of things to know about emotions. Let's just talk about that for a minute. Emotions just are. As we grow, we develop an emotional footprint. The shape of our emotional footprint is determined by what feelings we believe to be okay and which are not. That often comes from our family of origin. Emotions are not good or bad, they just are. And what we do with our emotions is what matters most. Not all behavior is appropriate, and yet painful emotions can be harder to express. So in a sense, emotion is like arms and legs, if you could picture that. If you hit or kick someone, then your arms and legs are causing you trouble. There's nothing wrong with your arms and legs. We need them. They're important, part of us. But the same is true of feelings. Feelings can interfere with listening. Often when people experience strong emotions, they're so busy managing the emotional response internally, they cannot listen to what the other person is saying. Maybe you found that for yourself. After someone has said something that triggered your emotions, you realize moments later you haven't heard a word they said. You froze emotionally in that moment. How about this one? Good people have negative emotions. An assumption we can make is that there are certain emotions that good people should never feel. For example, some people believe that good people never get angry at the people they love. They don't cry, or they don't feel jealous, or they're never a burden. Paul talks about how to walk out those emotions when we read the scriptures, when we feel them, but he doesn't indicate they're not our experience or the human experience. How about this? Sometimes what we feel is not how we feel. Feelings that we find uncomfortable will often disguise themselves as feelings that we're more comfortable with. For example, you might feel vulnerable or threatened in a situation, but you experience that emotion as anger because anger is actually more comfortable for you. In fact, expressing anger can be the safer way to express our deeper feelings of being threatened or vulnerable. So, learning to connect to the deeper feelings can make emotions more helpful in our difficult conversations. How about this? Don't confuse judgment with feelings. So we often think of sharing our feelings when we're actually sharing our judgments. So if I say to someone, "You're quite selfish," I'm not actually expressing a feeling. It's a judgment. The feeling is that I might be feeling overlooked or I'm feeling underappreciated. So if I say to someone, I feel like I'm being underappreciated or I'm feeling overlooked, is going to go way further than me saying, "I just think you're selfish." I'm going to make that conversation more difficult. So I think the conversation goes better when we look at it that way. Don't treat your feelings as gospel. Negotiate with them. Before saying what you are feeling, negotiate with your feeling. Our feelings are based on perceptions, and our perceptions are actually negotiable. How we feel about something depends on what information we have. You may be afraid of sharks, for example. If you were told that the shark you were encountering at the beach doesn't prey on humans, that it's not a human-eating shark, your fear will likely lessen. The shark has not changed, but your feelings about the shark have changed because you have more or new information. So ask yourself, what is the story you are telling yourself that's giving rise to how you feel? What is your story missing? What might be the other person's story? Well, there you have the overview of the first two themes, identity and emotions. When we step back from ourselves and ask identity questions and gain more understanding about the role of emotions, we will find difficult conversations easier. I look forward to part 2 and hoping you join me there. Talk soon.